Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. Today we're going to talk about John Locke, and he's one of the big ones. He's one of the most important authors that we'll read all semester. So today we're going to talk about one of his most famous books, two treatises of government, and we're only going to talk about a couple of chapters, but there's some very important ideas in here. So let's get started the way we always do, by introducing the author. So here he is, John Locke. And he did live quite a long time ago, 1632 to 1704, but his ideas have lasted the whole time. So John Locke is a little bit different from some of the other authors that we've read, since he's only medium wealthy. Oh, a big change, right? He was incredibly well educated. He studied at Oxford, and he studied political science. Essentially, it wasn't called that. And he also studied medicine. He got a doctorate of medicine and practiced as a physician for a while. But most of his studies there were sponsored. So his family was sort of wealthy. They were relatively well connected because his father was in the army. And so most of his education was sponsored by other people. And then as an adult, he essentially worked as a secretary or as a tutor also for other people. So he was sort of right there in the middle, well educated, but not like moat castle wealthy. So again, his impact has been incredibly lasting. He's often called the father of enlightenment. Sometimes he's called the father of liberty as well. But the things that he wrote about have been foundational. So some of his major achievements we're going to talk about in regard to this book, and others we're not. So one of the things that we're going to talk about for this book is natural rights. He was one of the first people to suggest that maybe all humans are born with certain rights. Life, liberty, property. He didn't say anything about happiness, but we'll get there. He's also famous for being one of the members of the Enlightenment philosophers who kind of ignore religion. He was not himself deeply religious, and he didn't want to argue that any of our rights came from God. So he argued more in favor of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. So he was one of the first people to suggest that humans are just born neutral. And he also wrote some really important stuff about religious freedom. So he was one of the people who believed that religion should be separate from government, a complete separation of church and state, which is another thing that we basically copied verbatim for our Constitution. So, what we're going to talk about today is his most famous book. So today we're going to talk about the two treatises on government. And there are two, and let me show you the real name of this whole book because it's just so wonderful. Two treatises of government. In the former, the false principles and foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and his followers are detected and overthrown. The latter is an essay concerning the true original extent and end of civil government. That's a great title, but as you can imagine, we mostly just refer to it as the two treatises. Most people don't even talk about the first treatise, and that's because the second treatise is so good. So he published it anonymously, and in fact he was really never finished with it. A lot of it is just lost, and he was always really mad at the publishers because they kept making mistakes and because they kept editing it where he didn't want them to. So it came out in 1689, but it didn't really become popular until almost a century later. Really, it was the 1770s where it started to become sort of a big hit, and it wasn't published in Boston until the early 1770s, and that's when the Founding Fathers started to read it. But the two treatises, even though it was an unfinished document for him, have gone on to be incredibly, profoundly impactful. So, the first treatise, like I said, we're not going to read, but it is kind of interesting. So basically, he's responding to this guy, Sir Robert Filmer, who had written this book called Patriarcha. And in Patriarcha, he argued that kings have a divine right to rule. And that furthermore, God decided this because every person who is descended from Adam, every man who is descended from Adam, can trace their lineage all the way back, and that's why they deserve to be kings. It wasn't very popular at the time, but it was a little bit popular, and Locke was mad about this theory. He did not care for it at all. So his whole first treatise is just a response to this. It's just him saying, number one, you understood scripture wrong. That's not what any of that said. That kind of patriarchy can lead directly to slavery, which we do not care for. And number two, nobody can trace their line back to Adam. That's just not a thing. This is the Adam and Eve Adam. No one can trace their line back that far. So his argument was, this is a stupid way to build a government. So he went on in the second treatise to explain some good ways to build a government, and that's what we're going to read. So chapter 1 is called Of Civil Government, which is a great title. And the best thing about this chapter is this beautiful run-on sentence. So what I'm going to do is kind of read it and talk about it at the same time instead of just reading it in one chunk. So, political power then, I take to be a right of making laws. All right, pretty good. The person who's in charge gets to make the laws. With penalties of death and consequently all less penalties. All right, so if you break the law, there are penalties, which range from like a slap on the wrist to death. For the regulating and preserving of property, again, loves property. Got to decide who owns it, how to sell it, how much you own, regulation. And of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws. So we're going to need some people to execute the laws. We're going to need courts, we're going to need judges, we're going to need police officers, that sort of thing. And in defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, in case we get attacked, we might need some people to help protect us. And all this only for the public good. So we're returning to that idea of the public good, the greater good. So, some parts of this sentence should sound familiar. A lot of this stuff we've already talked about a little bit. A lot of this stuff, it's fair to assume that he read, Aristotle. He definitely read Hobbes. So this idea that he has about what a government should be is crucial. There must be laws. There must be punishment for breaking the laws. There must be people who uphold the laws, and there must be people who help defend us in case of attack. But all of this is for everybody. So again, we're entering this idea of the greater good. It's not just the king, it's everybody. So this is a pretty big run-on sentence, but it's a good one. The other big idea from chapter 1 is about succession. So succession is essentially when something is handed down. Typically what he's talking about is when power is handed from the father to the oldest son, to his oldest son, to his oldest son, to his oldest, and so on and so on. So Locke argues this is a bad way to hand down power. And again, he's been watching the monarchies fall. He's been watching the way that secession has not really been very successful. So his argument is, unless you can trace your line all the way back to Adam, which you can't, then secession doesn't make any sense. And again, this might feel kind of obvious. This is something that we've rejected largely out of hand, but this was the way that everybody did things at the time. So for him to stand up and say, we're not going to do this anymore, was big. So, chapter 1, we know the role of government, we know it can't be secession, and that's all for chapter 1. In chapter 2, we return to the concept of the state of nature. But it's important to note that Locke's state of nature is much more chill than Hobbes' state of nature. So if you think about Hobbes' state of nature, which we read recently, it was pretty dark. Everything was that which you can get for as long as you can keep it. All the men were constantly stealing from each other. Nasty, poor, brutish, short, you remember. Locke's state of nature is much more peaceful. In his state of nature, everyone is free, and everyone is equal, and everyone should pretty much try to get along. So let's go through some of the definitions. So first, he talks about a state of freedom. So for him, this is what freedom means. To order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they see fit, within the bounds of the laws of nature, without asking leave or depending on the will of any man. So for him, freedom means kind of being able to do what you want without having to ask for permission. You can do what you want with your body. You can do what you want with your property. You don't have to ask if you can do a thing. So for him, freedom basically means that you can do what you want, but it's not an aggressive do what you want. It's just like a very chill do whatever you want. The other important part of that is that there's a sort of a state of brotherhood. So for him, part of freedom is giving other people freedom. Kind of a new thought. So this is what he says. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, so by like reason ought he, as much as he can, preserve the rest of mankind. So he argues that a big part of freedom is letting other people have freedom. And not just freedom, but like if you're preserving yourself, if your private property is going well, you got enough food, you got enough shelter, you should make sure that everybody else does too. That you should, as well as you can, take care of everybody else. This is again that greater good sort of thing. So if you have enough, you can share. It's a sort of an idea of brotherhood. This leads us to the state of equality. This part's important. Why would you share with other people, you might ask? And he argues because they're the same as you. Wherein all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank should also be equal one amongst the other without subordination or subjection. So, if we're living in this state of nature where everybody is free, everybody is also equal. There's not a hierarchy, you don't own someone, you're not better than somebody. There's pretty much just people who are equal one amongst another. And that's crucial for the state of nature. He argues that the state of nature contains no hierarchies. So, a state of freedom, a state of equality, and a state of sort of brotherhood in the middle to make sure that everybody has both of those things. So one thing that's important to remember here is that you do need a way to sort of punish people who do bad things. So this is something that also has come up over and over. Remember Hobbes said that you can just do whatever you want because those are also people? Locke says it's a little more complicated than that. Basically, his concern is that in nature, pretty much everybody has executive power. So if somebody does something, you can do whatever you want because you are the executive branch, essentially. So he says that in the state of nature, everyone has the executive power of the law of nature. So again, in the state of nature, everybody's equal, so everybody is the police, everybody is the judge, everybody is judge, jury, and executioner, which as we know doesn't go that well. So he says, that's kind of dangerous. The executive power in the state of nature can get out of hand really fast. So we should switch it to something more social, something a little bit more fair, which is how he describes the state of executive power in society. So in society, we turn executive power over to something a little more logical. And he says we do have laws, but the laws have to be fair. And furthermore, the punishment for breaking the laws has to be fair. So he says, ideally, we're going to try to do it where you have reparative justice. So reparative justice is where essentially you fix the thing that went wrong. Also, we shouldn't punish people for laws they didn't know existed. So in the state of nature, you're just making this up as you go. In society, we have to remember promulgation, right? We have to remember that people might not know they couldn't do that. So one example I think is nice would be graffiti. A reparative source of justice, if you did graffiti, you have to paint over the graffiti. But also, if you didn't know you couldn't graffiti, they can't punish you. So again, in nature, everybody punishes the way they see fit. In society, we have to be a little bit more fair. We have to have punishments that fit the crime, and we also have to remember that maybe not everybody knew about them. So again, chapter 2, state of nature is pretty chill, but once we join society, we should make laws and punishments that make good sense. So chapter 8 is where things start to really get exciting. Chapter 8 is called Of the Beginning of Political Societies. So here he's essentially talking about how we emerge from the state of nature into society. And the way that he says we do it is so logical. So here it is. The only way whereby one divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst the other, and a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater society against any that are not of it. So again, it's a nice little run-on sentence, but it's pretty great. So essentially he's arguing the only way that people are going to leave the state of nature and put on the bonds of civil society, like agree to be governed, agree to have laws, is by coming together with other men who want to do the same thing. So essentially, you wouldn't leave the state of nature unless there was something in it for you. And what he says is in it for you is a comfortable, safe, and peaceful living. So the only reason we would leave the state of nature is because we gain something really nice, which is a peaceful, safe way of life and a way to defend ourselves against anybody who might attack us. So the beginning of government is a bunch of people coming together and agreeing that they're safer together than they were apart. Which leads us to how we get along once we're in a society. And this is tricky, but one of the things that Locke notes that is really, really important is that we do have to make decisions that we can all agree on. But we're not really ever going to all agree. So the fairest way to make decisions in a community that you joined on purpose is majority rule. For when any number of men have, by consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community into one body, with the power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. So in short, The act of the majority passes for the act of the whole. So now that you've joined a society and you have to make decisions, the best way to do it is majority rule. This makes sense. You have all agreed to come together, you have all agreed to make decisions together. This is the fairest way to do that. The problem with majority rule is that sometimes you don't like the opinion of the majority. Sometimes you get outvoted. Like, just happens. Nothing to be done about that. So he reminds us that if you have agreed to majority rule, you have also agreed to submit to the judgment of the authorities. So, and thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and be concluded by it. So essentially, if you agree to majority rule, you agree that even if you don't like what they decided, you're going to submit to it and you're going to be concluded by it, which means that's the end of it. If you are outvoted, you can't keep talking about it, like, let it go, it's concluded. So, majority rule is definitely the fairest way to do things, even if you end up with a decision you didn't like. Now, one thing people questioned was, well, why not get total agreement? Why not wait to make a decision until everybody agrees? And Locke said essentially, never going to happen. So he says, for if the consent of the majority shall not, in reason, be received as the act of the whole and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole. But such a consent is next to impossible. So yeah, it would be amazing if everybody could agree on every decision, but it's just not going to happen. There's always going to be one weirdo. So the only way to kind of get things done in a respectable manner is to just go with majority rule, because nobody's going to agree on everything all the time. This is pretty logical. So now he gets into this idea about the legitimacy of a government. You can't just make one and call it even, you have to make a good one. So he says, and thus, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men capable of a majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And that is that, and that only, which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. So, this is an important set of sentences. Essentially, he's arguing that the only real, legitimate government is one that people got together and made on purpose, is one that the members of that society agreed to. Consent of the governed is going to be one of the biggest themes of John Locke, period, but definitely of the stuff we're reading today. So the only thing, he argues, that constitutes a real political society is the consent of the people who came together to make it, because that's what gives it power. You can't have power just by standing up and saying you have power. You can't have power just by having a really powerful daddy. You can only have power if the people gather together and agree. So again, I know this sounds pretty common and we're used to this idea now, but this was groundbreaking. This idea that the only real government was one that people came together and made on purpose. So now, he takes a little trick from Aquinas, and he starts disagreeing with himself just to see what would happen. He wants to make his arguments clear, right? So he says, there are no instances to be found in story of a company of men independent and equal amongst one another that met together and in this way began and set up a government. So this is a pretty solid argument. Basically, the argument is nobody's ever done that. Yeah, it's a nice idea, Locke. Everybody's going to come together, be all equal, be all free, agree on stuff. And the argument is no one's ever done this. Why would you think that would be possible? If it could be done, it would have been done by now. And his argument is, just because we haven't seen this happen doesn't mean it didn't happen. And this is very logical, because we do know that all over the world this does happen. It wasn't happening in England at the time, but that doesn't mean there's not the rest of the world. But also, he argues, just because we don't hear about stuff doesn't mean it didn't happen. For instance, just because we didn't hear about a bunch of great warriors when they were cute little babies doesn't mean they once weren't cute little babies. So the argument that we can't do something because we've never heard of it before, he says, is invalid. Because just because we haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not happening everywhere all over the world. The next argument is people saying, well, you can't just invent a government from scratch. You were already born into one. Why don't you just chill? He says, "It is impossible of right that men should do so, because all men, being born under government, they are to submit to that, and they're not at liberty to begin a new one." So this argument is basically, you can't just make a new government, you already have a government. You're obligated to submit to the government into which you were born. Why don't you just stay there and enjoy the government that somebody else already made for you? Locke's argument is, no thanks. Number one, people do this all the time. People establish new governments all the time. Like, remember, they had just overthrown the king. And also, people are born without governments all the time. So he argues you have to establish new governments sometimes, because sometimes people are born without one, and sometimes the one that you have is not good. So he says that doesn't make any sense. You can't just force people to stay in the government that they were in. You have to allow them to build new ones, and in fact, we do this all the time. So he does take a nice little turn with Aquinas in regard to like bringing up arguments against him and dismissing them, and I'm here for that. The other argument against building a society like this is actually pretty solid, and that argument is, why would we bother? We've been doing monarchy forever, why would we change it? So he says, "I will not deny that if we look back as far as history will direct us toward the original of commonwealths, we shall generally find them under the government and administration of one man." So he's like, yeah, you're not wrong. Most societies that we can look back at have been monarchies. But that doesn't mean monarchies are awesome. Because one of the things that people are questioning is like, why would we bother? Monarchy's working really well. And he's like, well, you're not wrong. Monarchies are very simple, for one thing, right? Like, so if you walk into a society and you're like, okay, who's in charge here? And they're like, that guy. Done. He's the source of power, he's the source of laws, he's the source of punishment, the end. It is very simple. And also, especially in this society, we were really used to patriarchy. Everybody was used to submitting to the will of their father, so it was kind of a short jump to submitting to the will of the king. You also submitted to the will of the priest, who submitted to the will of the pope. Like, we were used to this idea that there was one guy at the top and we should all just like look up at him and submit to him. So in that regard, we were used to having a king because like we were just doing what other men said anyway. He also argued that sometimes we put up with a monarchy because it's like it's so far away from us. Like, here we are in the country, we're all self-sufficient, doing our own thing, and the monarchy is like all the way over there. So sometimes we put up with monarchies just because they don't really bother us, because we're not part of what they're doing all the time. So he acknowledges, yeah, monarchies are simple, and we've had them for a long time, but the thing is, that doesn't mean they're good. And this is really important, because humans are lazy, and we hate change. It would have been really simple just to stay in a monarchy, just to like let loose. But his argument is, even though it's simple, and even though we've been doing it for a long time, that doesn't mean it's good. So now, it's time for change. And that brings us to 3 of Locke's most crucial arguments, and you're gonna love these. Number 1, just because you agreed to something does not obligate your children to agree to it. So, maybe you agreed to enter into a society, specifically a monarchy, but that doesn't mean your kids have to do it. You agreed, but those are totally separate people from you. This is a hard concept for parents. But basically, you are a person, they are a separate person. And just because you said you would do something does not mean they have to do it. Which brings us to point 2. You definitely can't force your children to submit to a government. So again, you might have agreed to something, but your children don't have to. You might have agreed to a government, they definitely don't have to agree to that. They might have to agree to some stuff, your religion, Christmas, I don't know, but they don't have to submit to a government. And that's because a government that they didn't submit to has no legitimacy. So essentially, you can't force your children into a system of government because that government won't have any real power because they did not consent to giving it power. Which brings us to the 3rd point. Times of peace require different kinds of leadership. So yeah, it's nice to have a king when you're at war. One person makes all the decisions. The army answers to one person. Like, we get it. That's pretty chill. But in a time of peace, this might not be the way to do it. In a time of peace, maybe we need to restructure ourselves so that we can take care of the greater good. It's not just a constant state of war. It's not a constant state of nature. In a time of peace, we need something a little better, a little more sophisticated, a little more consensual. So essentially, The main theme of this chapter is consent. The only real legitimate government is one that you agreed to be governed by. And consent is a pretty good thing just to rule your whole life by. I recommend it. But the idea here is that you don't have to give the government any power that you don't want to give to it. Somebody can't just stand up and proclaim that they're the king. Not a thing. The only government that really counts, that can really guide humanity, especially in regard to the greater good, is one that we consented to have. So, that's all we're going to talk about for John Locke for today, but don't worry, next week we're going to get into it even harder, because he has even more to say about how to build the best government possible. So I'll see you soon.